"Get that dog out of here." That's what the manager shouted in front of everyone. All eyes turned to the old man and the palm sitting quietly beneath his table. Some laughed, others whispered, but the veteran never raised his voice. He just stood, placed his hand on the dog's head, and walked out with dignity. 3 hours later, the restaurant's door opened and a wave of Marines stepped inside. If you believe loyalty should be honored, comment respect to salute the silent heroes. Frank, 73, was a retired Marine Corps medic, quiet, sharp-eyed, with a spine still straight despite the weight of memory. In his younger days, he'd run through gunfire to save men who called him Doc with reverence. Now he fought different battles against memories that ambushed him in quiet moments. His constant companion, Duke, a loyal black Labrador service dog, professionally trained to help manage his PTSD. The dog's gentle brown eyes missed nothing, his movements always in sync with Frank's needs. Duke wasn't just a domino, he was family. Trained to sense Frank's rising anxiety, Duke had saved him more times than Frank could count. When the nightmares came, Duke would press his weight against Frank's chest, grounding him back to reality. When crowds became overwhelming, Duke created space with his body, a living shield against the chaos. That afternoon, Frank entered Sapphire Bay Diner hoping for a quiet meal after a difficult morning at the VA hospital. The appointment had left him drained. Too many forms, too many questions, reopening old wounds. He chose a corner booth, arranging himself so Duke could lie silently at his feet, barely noticeable beneath the table. Duke settled into his trained position, alert but invisible, exactly as he had been taught. The waitress approached, hesitated when she saw Duke, then took his order without comment. Her name tag read Melissa. Frank remembered it. Remembering names was a habit from his service days. It mattered to know who stood beside you. But 10 minutes later, as Frank sipped his coffee, the manager stormed over, loud and irritated. His voice carried across the half-full diner. "Sir, you'll need to leave. We don't allow pets inside. It's a health code violation." Frank gently replied, voice steady despite the sudden tension in his shoulders. "He's not a pet. He's a registered service animal. I have his documentation right here." He reached for his wallet. "I don't care what papers you have," the manager snapped, waving dismissively. "Other customers are uncomfortable. Either the dog goes or you do." Heads turned, a few customers smirked, one even pulled out a phone to record the confrontation. Frank felt the familiar tightness in his chest, the beginning of panic. Duke immediately pressed against his leg, sensing the change. Frank remained composed. The military had taught him discipline in the face of hostility. He stood, gave Duke a soft command, "Heel," and clipped on his leash. They walked out in silence, no raised voice, no resistance, just a straight back and quiet dignity that spoke louder than any protest could have. Outside, Frank sat on a nearby bench, breathing slowly as Duke leaned against his leg, sensing the tremor beneath the surface. The dog's warm pressure was the anchor Frank needed as the familiar storm of anxiety threatened to overtake him. Cars passed, people walked by. No one stopped. One teen muttered to his friend as they passed, "What's with the bow? Some old man cosplay?" They snickered, not bothering to lower their voices. Frank looked down, running a weathered hand over Duke's head. His fingers found the spot behind the ears that made Duke's eyes half closed in contentment. He whispered, "We've been through worse, haven't we, boy?" 10 years ago, in a remote outpost in Afghanistan, Frank had saved 6 lives under heavy fire. His hands, now slightly trembling with age, had once been steady enough to tie off arteries while bullets kicked up dust around him. Duke had arrived years later, but the bond between them was forged in the same furnace: survival. Different battlefields, same war. He remembered the moment his unit was ambushed, the crack of gunfire, the shouts. Remembered crawling through dirt and blood to drag a wounded lieutenant to safety. The man had been hit in the leg, arteries severed. Frank had applied the tourniquet, whispering, "Stay with me, sir. That's an order." That lieutenant, Nathan Briggs, had survived, now a colonel somewhere. No parade when Frank got home, just silence, bills, and nightmares that left him gasping in sweat-soaked sheets. The transition to civilian life had been harder than any deployment. Duke had been trained to wake him from those nightmares, a gentle pressure, then a lick to the face if needed. Now he helped Frank navigate loud crowds, tight corners, and even grocery stores, places where panic could strike without warning. And yet one manager's word had erased all that, reduced them both to an inconvenience, a health code violation. A group of teenagers stood nearby, scrolling through their phones. One girl said, "I think I saw that guy on Facebook. Someone recorded him getting kicked out of Sapphire Bay. It's trending locally." Her friend laughed. Boomers and their emotional support pets. There's a difference between service dogs and just wanting your pet everywhere. Frank closed his eyes. His breathing quickened. Duke nudged his leg, pressure therapy, steady and calm. The dog knew what to do even when Frank didn't. From across the street, an older man in a faded navy cap nodded to Frank, but said nothing. Silent solidarity, but no one stepped in. No one challenged the injustice. Just another day in a world that had moved on without them. Frank reached into his wallet and pulled out an old photo. Him in uniform, younger, stronger, standing beside his unit, Bravo Company. Men who would have walked through fire for each other. Men who understood that loyalty wasn't conditional. One of those men, now Colonel Briggs, had once said, "If one of us is disrespected, all of us are." It wasn't just words. Then words became actions when it mattered. He meant it. Frank knew he had. The afternoon sun beat down mercilessly. Frank's throat was dry, but he hadn't brought water, hadn't expected to be sitting outside. A young mother walked by with her child who pointed at Duke and smiled. The mother quickly pulled the child closer, as if Frank and Duke were somehow dangerous. Frank sighed. This wasn't the first time, and it wouldn't be the last. The world had changed, but some battles remained the same. Invisible wounds still bled even decades later. And service animals like Duke, literal lifelines for veterans like him, remained misunderstood. With a slow breath to steady his hand, Frank sent a message to a private group chat titled, "Bravo Lives On." Sapphire Bay Diner, Duke and I asked to leave. Some battles aren't worth fighting alone. He didn't ask for help, didn't need to. The bond between them transcended words, transcended time. Then he folded the photo carefully along its well-worn creases and stood up. "Let's go home, buddy. Tomorrow's another day." Duke rose immediately, pressing close to Frank's side, a silent promise that whatever came next, they would face it together. 3 hours later, the Sapphire Bay Diner was in its usual dinner rush. Families laughed, waitresses hustled, and no one thought twice about the veteran they'd seen earlier. The incident had already faded from their memory, replaced by menu choices and small talk. Until the door opened, and in walked 6 Marines in full dress blues, a wall of pressed uniforms, polished buttons, and resolute expressions. The chatter died instantly. Silverware stilled mid-bite. Boots tapped in unison across the floor, the sound echoing in the sudden silence. The same waitress, Melissa, dropped her tray of waters, plastic glasses bouncing across the tile. The same manager stood frozen behind the counter, color draining from his face. Leading the formation, Colonel Nathan Briggs, tall, decorated, and unmistakable. Silver at his temples now, but the same unflinching gaze that had once commanded men in battle. The small scar above his right eyebrow, a reminder of the day Frank had saved his life. He approached the host stand, his voice carried without effort, the voice of a man accustomed to being heard. "The first time we're here to inquire about an incident this afternoon involving a former corpsman named Frank Wallace, accompanied by his service dog, Duke." The manager stammered, fingers nervously adjusting his tie. "We didn't know there was confusion. There are health regulations you didn't need to know." Briggs interrupted calmly. "Respect should be standard, not conditional. And the Americans with Disabilities Act is quite clear about service animals." One Marine, a sergeant, with 3 rows of ribbons, placed a framed photo on the counter. It showed Frank in uniform, a bronze star visible on his chest, and Duke beside him at a military ceremony. The sergeant spoke, his voice carrying to every corner of the now silent diner. "This man carried my best friend through enemy fire. That dog kept him alive long after the bullets stopped. They've both served this country better than most ever will." The other diners watched in stunned silence. A child stood on his chair to see better, only to be gently pulled down by his mother, who whispered something in his ear. The boy's eyes widened with understanding. The young woman, who had laughed earlier about emotional support pets, looked down at her half-eaten meal, tears welling. Her phone lay face down, now recording forgotten. "We're not here for vengeance," Briggs continued, his tone measured. "Marines don't operate that way. We're here to remind you what service looks like, what sacrifice looks like, and what respect for both should look like." Another Marine stepped forward, this one younger than the others. "Sir, my brother came home from Iraq with PTSD so severe he couldn't leave his house for 2 years. His service dog gave him his life back. When you disrespect a service animal, you're not just breaking the law, you're potentially destroying someone's lifeline." Briggs nodded gravely. "Service animals aren't pets, they're medical equipment that breathes. Would you ask someone to leave their wheelchair outside, their prosthetic leg, their medication?" The manager's face flushed with shame. I didn't think of it that way." "That's the problem," Briggs replied. "Too many don't think, they just react." He handed the waitress an envelope. Inside, a handwritten note from Frank. "I don't need apologies, just kindness for the next veteran who walks through your door. They may not have someone to stand for them then." Without fanfare, the Marines turned in perfect unison and began to leave. No meal ordered, no further words needed. Their presence had delivered the message more powerfully than any speech could have. But the ripple had begun. One diner, an elderly woman, paid her tab and followed the Marines outside, offering tearful thanks for their service. A father pointed them out to his son, explaining in hushed tones. A teenage boy who had been recording everything put down his phone suddenly, ashamed of his initial intention to post it for laughs online. The video from earlier was already being countered by new footage. Veteran denied for service dog, Marines respond with silent salute. Within hours, the diner's social media page was flooded with comments, some angry, some grateful, many sharing their own stories of service dogs that had saved lives after the battlefield, when the wars within raged on at home. Frank sat on his porch, Duke curled by his feet in the evening quiet. His phone buzzed nonstop with messages from old comrades and strangers alike. News outlets were calling, veteran groups were organizing. He didn't check any of it, didn't need to. He didn't smile, not quite, but his eyes softened as he watched the sunset. Duke licked his hand once, then settled his head on Frank's shoe. If this story moved you, type "never forgotten" in the comments. A week later, a polished bronze plaque appeared near the entrance of the Sapphire Bay Diner, in honor of Frank Wallace and Duke for service beyond the battlefield. The manager had resigned, replaced by a woman whose brother had served in Iraq. Her first official act, establishing a clear service animal policy and training all staff to recognize the difference between pets and service animals. Every Wednesday, the diner now held quiet table hour, a safe space for veterans with service animals. Lighting dimmed, music lowered, staff trained to minimize sudden noises. A small thing, but for some it meant the difference between eating in public or staying isolated at home. Frank returned, not for recognition, but because they asked him to. Because sometimes leadership means showing others the way forward, even when you'd rather stay in the shadows. This time, the waitress Melissa smiled with genuine warmth as she approached his table. She placed a bowl of water for Duke under the table without being asked. "On the house," she said, "for both of you." Children came by with drawings of bumps and flags. One boy saluted Frank, saying proudly, "My uncle has a service dog too, since he came home from Syria." Frank nodded, then, "He's never alone. That's what matters most." A small section of the wall was covered with stories, handwritten notes from veterans and families about what service animals had meant to them. Stories of midnight terrors soothed, of public panic averted, of lives literally saved. The manager's resignation had made local news, sparking conversations about service animals in public spaces.
3 other restaurants in town had already implemented similar policies. A local politician was drafting legislation to require service animal awareness training for all food service employees. What had started as humiliation had become a movement. Quiet, but determined, just like Frank himself. Frank added one note himself, his handwriting neat but slightly shaky. Every flag we saluted, every oath we took, it wasn't for medals. It was for moments like this, for the right to live with dignity in the country we served. That night, as the lights dimmed for quiet hour, Duke rested his head on Frank's boot beneath the table. The same table where they'd been humiliated now felt like a small victory. And for the first time in a long while, Frank didn't feel like a shadow in his own country, didn't feel like he had to explain his existence, justify his needs, or apologize for his scars, both visible and invisible. Subscribe to Ironheart Stories if you believe true service deserves more than silence.